Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Adriana Bankston. I'm currently the Chief Outreach Officer for the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. This event is the first in a series of policy memo writing workshops leading up to our special topics issue on intersectional science policy with a submission deadline of May 2nd. This issue is sponsored by the National Science Policy Network and supported by the Society for Advancement of Chicanos, Hispanics and Native Americans in Science, 500 Women Scientists, and the National Society for Black Engineers. Part of the issue, we also have an International Policy Memo Competition, which is intended to raise awareness of intersectional science policy issues that affect marginalized scientists and communities. So I'll post a link to the issue in the chat. So within this theme, this series of workshops will equip students, policy fellows, and early career researchers with the skills needed to write effective policy memos, addressing justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in all sectors of science, technology, and innovation policy. Today's event is focused on impactful and inclusive policy memo writing and co-hosted in partnership with SACNAS. So before we dig into memo writing, I want to just provide a little bit of background on JSPG for those who may not be familiar with the journal. So I'm going to also share our website in the chat. So JSPG is an internationally recognized open access peer-reviewed publication. We cover every corner of science and technology policy. Through the journal, we bolster research and writing credentials for early career scholars in science policy and encourage them to engage in policy discourse and debate. We publish op-eds, technology assessments, memos, analyses, white papers, book reviews, workshop proceedings, and other research articles. We also promote publications through our global mailing list and events such as this workshop, webinars, and a podcast where we interview published authors. You can follow JSPG on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We also have a YouTube channel where we post all of our recordings, and we'll be posting today's event as well. So if you want to follow us, I'll post a few of our accounts in the chat and also a link to our newsletter where you can keep up with future events. Okay. So with that introduction, let's move into today's event. Just to remind you, please mute and turn off your video throughout the session while we have speakers to draw attention to what they're discussing. And then in terms of what to expect, I'll share a link to the schedule. I sent this by email, but just in case it's helpful to be fresh in your mind. So we'll have some opening remarks and then a presentation on memo writing. Then we'll practice for the rest of the time writing memo outlines in breakout rooms, and then we'll come back and recap as a group. So feel free to ask your questions in the chat. You can send them directly to me through the private chat, and I'll do my best to ask the speakers your questions. So now I'd like to begin by introducing Dr. Stephania Herrera, who will give a few opening remarks. Dr. Herrera is currently the Executive Director of SACNAS. And prior to SACNAS, she had many different roles. She was a Chief Operations Officer for the Hispanic Heritage Foundation. She was an Executive Director of the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education. She was Director of the Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers Foundation, as well as President and CEO of the United States Hispanic Junior Chamber of Commerce. Dr. Herrera received the 2002 Minority Small Business Advocate of the Year Award from the U.S. Small Business Administration in Colorado, and was twice recognized for the United States Congressional Record for her leadership in the community. So Dr. Herrera, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for allowing us and letting us be part of this, and our members as well. So I will start sharing my screen and talk to you a little bit today about SACNAS and who we are, what we do, and where we're going. So welcome everyone, excited to be here. My staff put in a lot of work. I should say our staff put in a lot of work to get this going, including with Adriana as well. So very excited to be a part of this workshop. So SACNAS, right now by the numbers, we serve and grow communities over 28,000 supporters and including, so 8,200 members. So I know we have a lot of members on this call, so thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. And they're from all STEM disciplines and backgrounds. Our last conference we had last year, we had 5,000 plus attendees. So it was one of our largest conferences ever. And we're looking forward to increase those numbers this year. And right now we have 118 chapters across the United States and Puerto Rico. So who is SACNAS? What do? We support talent. So we have a lot of companies, organizations, colleges, and universities that come to us and work with us to develop our talent. So we put together a lot of workshops, a lot of training for our members in diverse STEM arenas, areas. So we also are building a national network of powerful and innovative, inclusive STEM professionals, and we provide tools and support to advance them in their careers. So we also train, and what we do, we train, we have conferences, we have regional meetings, webinars, and other events provide participants with opportunities to learn and most definitely practice skills for education and their career. So I know this picture last year, we had 113 training sessions at our conference, and I had a lot of people. So you can see this is a poster presentation. So we have many people come to us in this area as well. We're a National Diversity in STEM conference. So we have a multiple day conference, equips, empowers, and energizes participants. So you can see we have the scientific research, professional development sessions, wonderful keynote speakers. A lot of times we leave in tears, tears of gratitude and tears of happiness. We have graduate school representatives, a career hall expo. And then we always model inclusions and best practices for all attendees and partners. We also connect. And as you can see here, this was a mentoring session. So you can see the mentors and the mentees, but we connect students and professional with academic, industry, and policy leaders through our conference, and most importantly, year round for our members. 6 months after the conference, 76% of the students reported that they came away with from the conference motivated to go further in school than they previously thought possible. We do have a number of our members who are first generation college, and then others who are very happy to have a family, a familia, to help them, to push them to answer questions because they might not see people that look like them or talk to like-minded people as well. The other item that I know makes us unique is we bring our whole selves. When we come to the conference, we celebrate our culture, we celebrate the diversity and our connections. So you bring your whole self to science, you bring your whole self to STEM. And then we always include cultural programming from music to powwow to blessings and talks from our elders. We also inspire. So SACNAS connects students to role models and opportunities. And we have 93% of the students who attend the conference. If they're not members, they want to become part of us. So we're working on putting together more return on investment, or I would say ROI, for our members. You know, what can we do? How can we help them? And listen to them as well. And then 91% of the students reported meeting people who can help advance them in their career. So with the connections, it's very important. And we've been able to track students from college on up to postdoc, see if they go into industry, see if they go into the labs, whatever that looks like. So we're very blessed to inspire, but of course, all of you know, when you see somebody that's like you doing it, then you can also think I can do it as well. So we have different ways to get involved, and one is to join our network. So we're looking at increasing our members, and we'd love to have all of you as part of our membership. So becoming a member, we have many different levels. And then people to partner with. So we're always looking for partners because right now, communities, corporations, they need us. So they're coming to us, and I will tell you, we have a job board. And I think last year we had over 2,000 posts on our job board for jobs. So we have a lot of employers, universities that are looking at hiring talent, getting talent, recruiting talent to go to their programs. So we're very much here to train and to connect and to inspire. So the last item, let's get started. We'd love to have you part of the family. Let us know if you have any questions, anything. We'd love to hear from you, especially our members. What are we doing? I know we put out surveys and we'll continue to do that as well, but we're excited to dig in, be able to have this training session and to train those of you who want to be trained in policy. Let's do it. Let's see what we can do. So with that, I will hand it back to Adriana for questions.
Great, thank you so much for that presentation. So one of the things that you mentioned, the sort of this sense of community within SACNAS and bringing your whole self to science and policy. Can you elaborate a little more, given what we're discussing here today, what that means in terms of policy?
Sure, it means that I, as Doctora Stephania Herrera, can walk into a room and say my name that way, Stephanie Herrera, and be who we are. So our culture, what we do, how we speak, our accents, the way we look, it's all an asset to us. And that's what we bring to the classroom. That's what we bring to the lab. That's what we bring to Congress, whatever it may be, because this is who we are. And a lot of times I've been a part of corporate America and you can't necessarily be yourself or have curly hair or whatever it may be. There's a lot of different norms. And at SACNAS, we see it as an asset. We want you to be you, because when you're truly yourself, true diversity, you're stronger, you're more powerful. And that's what we want our leaders to be, because I consider our members leaders. We're leaders in the community, and the more we train, the more we share, the more we're going to be able to do to move forward. So it's beautiful, because I've never had an organization that I ran, worked with, led, was a member of say that, be proud of who you are. So we're very blessed, very, very blessed in these date and times to be that and represent who we are, and we're educated, and this is what we do. So it's a very good time at SACNAS.
Great, thanks for that. So delving a little more deeply into, we'll be discussing a few issues related to diversity today, but can you give us a few examples of issues that SACNAS advocates for?
Right now, it's more on an education access perspective. So since we're a membership organization, it's, do our students have money to come to conference? And we have a very big Native American initiative. And sometimes it's like, do our members have food? How can we help the tribes? How can we help the community? How can we help the reservations? How can we help, our people on many different levels? So it's access. It's also providing role models, because you are who you see. So if you're not seeing us on TV, you're not hearing about all the good things we're doing in science and in STEM, you have different perspectives. So getting the word out there, letting them know who we are. We're also working on a lot of partnerships with other organizations, because, together we're greater, we're stronger, we're faster instead of divided, and we're not going to be divided anymore. So we are very excited to come together and to work with organizations such as yours. And I, very excited to work with you, Adriana. She's a member, a volunteer for our organization. So it's great, because we can multiply what we do through each voice. So, and ensuring that our voices are being heard.
Yeah, absolutely. Very happy to be working with you as well. So my last question, sort of framing this around what writing and communication, inclusive communication, that we'll be discussing in the breakouts. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means to you?
So writing, diversity, words have power, and it depends on which way you choose to use them. So I commend all of you coming to this workshop to learn how to write the way that we need to for policies. So then you can then take it back to your community, to your state, to your local government, and see if we can make changes. So I am very much on the forefront, as is our board, that we need to continue to make a statement, let people know we're here, we're educated, we care, we're watching them, and that we will take action if necessary. So it means a lot to me, this workshop, and I know it does to our members. So can't wait to hear, who's out there doing what, and let us know how we can help as well at a national level.
Great. Yeah, definitely. So we have a question in the chat. Can you define intersectional policy? Or I mean, I probably could, but maybe I'll put that to you. What does intersectionality mean from your side?
From my side, that's a very good question, because there's so many different perspectives. So Adriana, if you could answer that for the sake of the workshop, which way you will be taking it, because I have 2 or 3 different ways. I've been thinking about that so let's just make sure we're on the same page and on track.
Yeah, we can have a discussion about this. So from my perspective, it's really, celebrating, like you said, all the different aspects of a person, right? That you sort of, what you mentioned about bringing your whole self, all the different things about you that we need to celebrate here. And then specifically, for this workshop, given that we're partnering with SACNAS, I'm hoping that will sort of come out of these conversations, values and things that SACNAS cares about, and discussing those things which I think are generally applicable, but really focusing on some of the things that relate to the identities that are within your membership. That's sort of how I see it. But if you have other thoughts?
No, I agree. And you're exactly on track, because we do have values. We do have different items that we're working on, different stances that we take. So, like I said, it's going to be very uplifting to see what the members are going to write about, what's important to them. So, like I said, how we can work together to make it better for our communities.
And I see there's a question about the website, so I'm going to share the SACNAS website in here. Feel free to check it out. So we'll talk about the memos later once we go through the actual structure with Libby. Any other questions? All right, looks like no. Thank you so much for your talk. So hopefully this is a great start, sort of frame what we're doing here today and think about sort of the values that you brought up here. So thank you for that.
And I would like to thank you, all of our partners, our sister organizations, and our members as well. And those of you who will become members, we'd love to have you join our family and see how we can move together and share all of our successes. So thank you, everyone, for spending the time with us today.
Great, thanks so much. So we'll move on to our next speaker. Okay, let's see. Okay. So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Libby O'Hare. So she'll be talking to us about writing policy memos. Libby is a senior principal at Burke Associates, a full-service government relations and consulting firm that specializes in advocating for the public policy interests of institutions at the intersection of research, science, higher education, and healthcare. At Burke, Libby leads the biomedical research portfolio, advising clients in federal research policy and healthcare with a focus on the National Institutes of Health. Libby got her start in science policy as a AAAS Congressional Science Policy Fellow and gained experience on Capitol Hill working for Rush Holt. Prior to her role at Burke, Libby directed several high-profile studies at national academies on higher education and workforce issues. Libby, thank you so much for being here today. I'm looking forward to your talk.
Great. Thanks, Adriana. It's a pleasure to be with everyone this afternoon, and thanks for inviting me. So let me share my screen. And start here. And Adriana, can you confirm that you can see the slides?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks again. I have a brief presentation, and then I hope that we can get into some questions and discussion. So really, I'm going to focus on sort of first defining science policy, or at least sort of how I think of what science policy is. Then talk a little bit about the science policy communication landscape. Who are the stakeholders? What is the process? And then in the second half of my remarks, transition into some of the elements of effective policy memos And then, as I said, have some time definitely for questions and discussion. And we already had some good questions coming in the chat, so look forward to those. So what is science policy? So I'm going to kind of give you this little bit of a framework, but I will say as a caveat at the beginning that there are many, many people who think about this question, and there are many answers to this question, but this is just a framework that I have found useful in my career as I've moved into science policy. So the first way to think about this is to think about policy for science. So these are policies that affect the conduct of science and research. So you might think of things like, what are the appropriate funding levels for the National Institutes of Health or the National Science Foundation or NASA? Within those agencies, what are the appropriate research priorities? How much should an agency be investing, say, for example, on climate change? How much should an agency be investing, say, for example, developing new approaches to take us to Mars or other planets? And then the third piece here is really the regulatory structure that impacts federally funded research, mostly at universities, but also at other types of research organizations and institutions. And so these are things like, what are the regulations, what are the federal regulations and guidance that impact, for example, research involving human participants or research using and involving animals? And what do those guidelines look like? How are they shaped? So these are really these issues in policy for science, and this is really the area in which I work. The other area, or the other way to think about what is science policy, is what we would call science for policy. So here we're thinking about leveraging research and evidence to inform decision making. And of course, we all know that our society faces numerous complex scientific and technical challenges on many different scales. Of course, the COVID pandemic is a great example of such a challenge, but also you can think about climate change, the use of precision medicine, health equity, things like that. And so science for policy is really this process of people who are experts taking their knowledge and sort of translating that into formats that are usable for policymakers as they're thinking about, appropriate policies, for example, to respond to the changing climate, for example. So that's, again, just a quick overview of a framework that I find helpful. So now kind of getting in specifically to the science policy communication landscape, I think there are three real main areas to think about: stakeholders, process, and then formats and or sort of the venues for these types of communications. So who are the stakeholders in science policy? Well, that's an exhaustive list, and I have just pulled out a few of the stakeholders that come immediately to my mind. So you have many different publics. Of course, you have the legislative branch, you have the Congress with the House and the Senate. You also have the federal agencies in the White House and the executive branch, state and local governments, of course, as well. And then many, many, many different types of non-governmental organizations. So these can be entities like economic development organizations, advocacy organizations, nonprofit organizations that sort of get government contracts to sort of do work on behalf of the federal government. The NGO bucket is very, very big. And then you can also think about organizations, as I think of them, as sort of influencing sort of the thought process in sort of generating ideas that lead to policy changes. And these, the best example of this would be the so-called think tanks. There are many different think tanks. I'm using think tank sort of as a generic term there. And then I mentioned as well, advocacy organizations are also some of the stakeholders here. So how do we map these stakeholders into sort of a taxonomy of the process? And again, this is a graphic of, a cartoon. It's not meant to be exhaustive. It's meant to really just help us kind of get a high level overview of this process. So really, I think about these sort of four main buckets of processes. The first is, there are organizations, there are stakeholders that are sort of working to identify and define problems and to develop ideas and approaches. Now that sounds ambiguous, but really it's sort of these thought leaders, these thought influencers that are sort of trying to understand what is the policy landscape, what are the things that sort of need policy solutions. And so groups that work this are the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine that folks maybe are familiar with. The think tanks, of course, here as well. Federal staff at the federal agencies, of course, are also working in this space. When you then shift to policy creation, the first thing that comes to mind, I think, for most people would be Congress, right? Of course, the legislature is drafting and creating policy through the bills that become law. But of course, federal agencies can also create their own policies to govern their own agencies, to govern their own employees. And then, of course, the White House, Office of Science and Technology Policy is an important player here as well. Then if you think about implementation, so if you're kind of following this pathway, implementation of new policies, implementation of legislation, you're really here now talking about the federal agencies, but you're also now seeing some of these non-governmental organizations or these third-party organizations that can come in and through government contracts work to implement different types of policies and programs. And then finally, assessment, which is, I think, a very, very important part of the science policy process. You're going to see these NGOs again here, but also think tanks will often be involved in this, and then, of course, the agencies themselves. And then this is really my bias as an advocate, but I think that for me, the important piece is that advocacy and the role of advocates really plays a role in all of these sort of different stages and all of these sort of sectors of this taxonomy. And I'm happy to talk more about that in the Q&A. So then when we think about the different formats for science policy communication or the venues, so I think there are really three kind of major types of formats. The first would be these reports and summaries that are what we would consider to be policy neutral. So this is probably most akin to the idea of a literature review that folks are probably familiar with from the sort of scientific perspective, where you're really kind of looking at the existing body of knowledge in a particular area and summarizing that. And you're not necessarily going that extra step, which is to make a specific policy recommendation or to advocate for a specific policy recommendation. So some examples of this would be the National Academy of Sciences. When they do workshops, they have workshop proceedings. These are these policy neutral summaries. Think tanks as well can produce these types of reports. And then an entity called the Congressional Research Service, which is a nonpartisan group of experts that works directly for the Congress, both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And their sole job is to provide these policy neutral reports. And those are really important in informing the legislative process. So then the kind of second category, these policy position papers, are what this workshop is about. And so here you're including some of the, some of the reporting and the summarization of sort of existing knowledge and evidence, as in the policy neutral report. But then you're also adding in an explicit preference for a specific outcome or outcomes. And as I mentioned, JSPG is a good example of, I think, of a journal that's really publishing and soliciting these types of policy position papers. Also Issues in Science and Technology, which is a journal that's published through the National Academy of Sciences. But then you can also think about op-eds that we've all seen in, LA Times, Washington Post, New York Times, and then I've included some, the Hill and Politico, which are sort of specific to the sort of Washington, DC congressional world. But op-eds are often a way where you can advance specific policy preferences. And then the last category I have down here at the bottom, not necessarily relevant for the workshop today, but I did want to just include it. So these are memos for decision makers. And really here, what you're trying to do is to persuade a policymaker to make a specific choice or to, make us to move towards a specific policy. And so here, probably the most obvious would be such a memo to a member of Congress. But you could also think about the head of an agency, the head of the National Science Foundation, for example. And then advocacy organizations, again, are going to be key in that particular sector as well. Okay, so moving on now to kind of the second half of the talk. So thinking about just sort of some of the elements and some of the general guidance for policy communication. And I think you'll hear these questions will really become the refrain that I think we'll be talking about during the workshop. So first, you want to think about, well, what problems are you trying to address? And this actually seems obvious, and it is somewhat obvious, but it's actually an important question because the landscape here can be somewhat ambiguous. And so, this is where I think our transferable skills as a scientist come into play, which is that ability to sort of chunk things and then to define problems and to kind of take that analytical view. So what problems are you trying to solve? How do you define the problem? It's very important to think about who is your audience, who are those stakeholders that are going to be that you're sort of writing for, that are going to be taking in this information. And you want to think about why will those audience members, why should they care about the problem as you're presenting it? And that will help you sort of think about the different types of evidence that you might want to marshal and the different approaches you can take. What are the policy proposals to address these challenges? And so here's really, again, where you're sort of using supporting arguments, you're sort of marshaling that evidence as it may exist, or pointing out where there are gaps in evidence that we need to rectify. One important point is, are you proposing a new policy or are you proposing to modify an existing policy? And that is a subtle difference for sure, but it actually has big ramifications, I think, for sort of how, at least, in my world, focusing on the federal government, in terms of how the federal government is working and making change. And then, the last thing I'll say on this slide, I think that this is a really key piece, and it's something that was really where I felt that I had a bit of a learning curve when I was making the transition from being a scientist to working in science policy, which is that you really want to try to anticipate what might be some of the common arguments against your policy proposal. And you want to think about how you might address them. And even if you're not addressing them explicitly in the piece of writing that you're producing, if you're trying to sort of advance that policy, you really need to be ready to sort of play defense almost as you're sort of thinking about how you're communicating these ideas. And I'm happy to talk more about that piece. So on the next slide here, I've just made a little bit of a graphic to kind of talk about some of the key structural differences that I see between scientific papers, which again, I think most of us are familiar with, and then policy communications, policy memos, policy reports. So on the left, right, we all know that we sort of start with the title and the abstract sort of at the top, and we get more and more detailed in a scientific paper as we kind of go through that paper. And then, often the most noteworthy material in the form of the results is sort of halfway through or even sometimes near the end of that particular paper or communication. In the science policy space, it's the complete opposite. So you actually want to spend most of your time and most of the detail on those findings and recommendations, the policy findings, the policy recommendations. That's the most noteworthy information that you're presenting. And that's really what should come first and should have the most detail. Then you can see that you would get into some additional, supplementary details. And then finally, just a little bit of that more background and general information. And so this is a real shift. It's something that I certainly had to get comfortable with when I was kind of, starting off in science policy to make this change. Okay, and so then, and we talked a little bit about this before, but here on the right, you can sort of think of another way, another graphic to kind of think of what this looks like. So, what are these elements? So again, define that problem that you're seeking to solve, identify the stakeholders and their positions, identify the desired outcomes. You're going to assemble your evidence. You're going to identify these possible paths to achieve your desired outcomes. And again, that crucial piece that I mentioned before, which is to really try to anticipate the pros and cons, the trade-offs, and alternative views. And that will help you in the long run as you're sort of both writing the memo, but also anticipating how you're going to move forward with the recommendations. So then here we have just an example, and thanks to Adriana for identifying this example for me. So, you sort of have, this is just the executive summary of a particular memo, right? So there's a longer document here, but you're really starting with, what do we know, what do we recommend, and what are sort of some of the anticipated barriers and or limitations. And so it's really, again, very concise, starting just with that background and that context, and then really the recommendations are the most important piece. All right, and this is my last slide, and just to think about, so as you're working on the memos, it's often helpful to think about how are policy options evaluated, what kinds of considerations are at play. So of course, effectiveness and efficiency, and these are often, we don't often have it's not always the case that we have the answers to these types of considerations. But of course, we all are striving for evidence-based policymaking. So effectiveness, efficiency, equity, of course, is critical. So is your proposed policy equitable? Who benefits, who suffers if changes are made, but also importantly, if any changes are not made. And then finally, the feasibility or the political landscape concerns. So, how is the proposal likely to be received by policymakers? Which stakeholders are likely to support and which are likely to oppose? These sort of four topics here, I think, can be helpful as you're kind of thinking about that longer term process with the outcomes of the memos. So with that, I just have questions and discussion. So I guess, Adriana, should I stop sharing my screen then? And we'll go to questions.
Yes, let's do that. I will do this so we can. Okay, great. So what I've seen in the chat, you may have already addressed some of this. So what sort of stakeholders write memos? Do you have to work for the government? How are they effective? Are they effective if they come from constituents? Can you talk about what groups write memos?
Yeah, sure. So I think I did kind of talk a little bit about that when I talked about the stakeholders. So the answer to that question is it's somewhat of a complex ecosystem. So when you think about a constituent, so let's say you wanted to go talk to your member of Congress about something, it's unlikely that a constituent on their own would sort of write a memo, but you might think about being part of an organization, as a professional, as a scientist, or as a community member, and that you could contribute to that organization's materials, and those are what's being communicated with the policymaker, excuse me. If you are working on Capitol Hill, if you're working in an agency, then yes, you're much more common. You're going to be writing those memos yourself. I think, does that answer it?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Okay, let's see what else. So what I had written before, sort of, which you kind of touched upon, but how are memos different from other kinds of policy writing?
Yeah, so so I think I tried to touch on that a little bit with the little triangles, comparing directly sort of a scientific paper with a policy memo. Memos are policy memos are almost always, shorter. They're briefer. You want to get right to the point right away. And the findings and recommendations are the most important thing. And the evidence, while very important, comes after the findings and the recommendations. And I will say, I appreciate that this workshop is about a specific type of policy memo. There's many types of policy memo writing, right? And I tried to kind of get to that. And, There's one-page memos that you might write. You also, might actually write a policy memo in the form of an email to a decision maker too. So there's a lot of variety there.
Great. So there was a question about what are characteristics of a good argument section. So I've sort of had this before too. How do you sort of make your memo be more effective? Maybe you can answer this as part of that question.
Yeah, so what are the characteristics of a good argument section? Yeah, so I think, so that's why I kept harping on this idea of trying to anticipate what some of the common alternatives or some of the objections to your particular proposal might be. The more that you can do that, then you can kind of bake that into your arguments and your evidence that you're putting forth. And so that really helps to kind of to buffer, or to sort of bolster your argument, I think. So I think that's one thing. The other thing I will say is just clarity and conciseness. So I spend a lot of my time helping, faculty at universities try to take their research, which is very complicated and they know very, very well, and really to synthesize it, right, and make it bare bones. And so it's much harder to write a one-page document than it is to write a 10-page document, right? So those I think are the characteristics of strong memos and strong argument sections.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So I'm gonna maybe ask sort of the flip side of that. Have you seen any common mistakes in memo writing, or what not to do?
So yeah, I mean, I think one thing not to do is to go on for too long, right? You want that conciseness, you want that cohesiveness. I think another big mistake that people make is either not having put the time in to identify the audience, or they did identify an audience, but then when they tried to go to a different audience, they didn't adapt the memo, right? And so a key thing with science communication and science policy communication is that you're often taking the same concept and you're having to communicate it in different ways and sort of on different levels. And so the way I think about this is the following. So I'm trained as a neuroscientist. If I'm going to talk about the relevance of neuroscience research, say for early childhood education policy, I'm going to talk about that in a different way to another neuroscientist or a physicist or my next door neighbor or a member of Congress who's trained as a lawyer. Those are all different types of audiences, but I'm communicating the same concepts. So you have to sort of think about that piece of it. And I think that that's a mistake that I often see, which is I've written this memo, the audience is the member of Congress, but then when I want to talk to, an agency leadership person, I haven't adjusted the message.
Yeah, definitely. That'll be very helpful as we're trying to work on practice writing in the rooms. So one question here, if you're working on science for policy more than policy for science, how can you use your expertise to inform your writing?
Yeah, well, I think actually it's easier if your research applies to science for a policy. So I obviously don't know what your research is, but I'll use climate change just as an example. I think that everyone understands. So if you are working in, atmospheric sciences, then you have that expertise that you can then use to marshal the evidence and to develop your arguments in the policy memo. And so then the real thing that you need to be careful of, right, is to be concise and to be sparse with your communications. So I think that you have a lot of expertise that you can bring to bear in that case.
Great. One other question that sort of relates this to academic writing. So I think what it's asking is how you so it's saying how would a policy memo rank for review, for grad students, postdocs, faculty, compare traditional research articles. So I think it depends on where you submitted, but the second part of this question is how would you recommend writing a traditional paper and then a policy memo based on that research? So I think this is a good question because obviously a lot of folks are writing academic papers. And so I could see sort of, you know, the memo coming from that and sort of another perspective. Do you have thoughts on that?
I think, Adriana, you might be able to answer that a little bit more from the perspective of JSPG. I mean, I would say that, so I'm thinking back now to when I made the transition from being a postdoc to working in science policy. And it was actually easier for me to do things, to work on topics that I didn't know anything about. As I mentioned, my background is in neuroscience, but I found myself working on Capitol Hill and writing memos about the U.S. Postal Service and what are the appropriate, you know, ways to ensure the long-term financial stability of the Postal Service. And it was easier for me to do that because I had to do the research myself and figure it out, as opposed to how do I take, you know, a scientific paper that I've published on brain development and then translate that. But I don't know, Adriana, if you have other thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's a good thought because, like I said, I think it's a good exercise if you want to write on your research to try and make it sort of more broadly applicable. You know, it's a good exercise for academics to try and write for these different audiences, as you mentioned, right? So that's, and you know, as we mentioned, you know, JSPG is more sort of more academic than other types of memo writing. So, but again, I think it'll be important to think about what the audience is and how you do that. But I think for academics, it's very helpful to think about how a memo or something relates to their research, but is very broad. And again, like you said, targeted to a specific audience. So there's more questions. Let's see. Okay, so there was a question about sort of your transition. So that's a little bit out of scope here, but I'll sort of reframe this to how did you gain the experience to write memos and maybe through your transition into policy? Can you talk about how that might happen?
Yeah, so I moved into science policy as a AAAS science policy fellow, as a congressional fellow. So I went from being a postdoc in a neuroscience lab to working on Capitol Hill. And so it was a really, it was a fast learning curve. I was thrown sort of into the deep end there and had to kind of figure out, you know, how to write in this way. But there are a lot of resources in the AAAS fellowship program. There are many, many, many more resources available now for people who want to make this transition than when I was making this transition 15 years ago. So I think there are a lot of resources out there, including workshops like this, which are phenomenal. And I wouldn't even have known something like this was even possible 15 years ago. So thank you, Adriana, for doing it.
Great, that's really helpful. I know there's a lot of folks here who are in transition or interested in sort of folks who have transitioned and how they've done that. So we can discuss that some other time. One other question, and thank you. This is great. More questions coming in. So how do people in science frame themselves to be credible in the policy world? So I think it's a worthwhile argument of how sort of establish your credibility.
So sorry, the question is, how do people in science frame themselves to be, oh, okay, got it. Yeah, so actually, there's still, scientists are generally well regarded, highly regarded by the American public, by your you know, average policymaker. And by average, I mean not a scientist who's also a policymaker, but sort of a, you know, an elected official or something like that. I think that there is a recognition, a relatively widespread recognition that we do have a lot of complex challenges that need scientific expertise, that need technological expertise. And policymakers are very hungry for that and want to seek and are seeking that out. And so I don't think it's an issue of framing yourself to be credible. I think it's more of a challenge. The challenge is more on the side of, how do I adapt? I'm a scientist, I'm trained in a certain way, I'm used to communicating in a certain way. How do I adapt that so that I can take all the great knowledge that I have for an environment that's very different? For, when I'm working with people who have backgrounds, for example, in law or public policy and things like that. But I think, and again, I'll just say that a lot of the different fellowship programs, there's a lot of different opportunity, different types of opportunities, fellowships, internships, et cetera, different programs that really help in that transition, which helps you sort of, navigate as you're sort of reframing your professional identity, your knowledge base, et cetera.
Great. One question this comes up a lot is, what are good sources for information when you're writing policy memos? Because obviously it's not like, academia, you go to PubMed and find all that. So, where can they go to find relevant information?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Okay, so I have a couple of thoughts on that. So in my remarks, I talked a lot about the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine. And I did work there for 3 years, so I think I probably talk about them maybe more than other people. But so so this is an organization that basically functions as science advisors to the Congress and the nation. And so the organization convenes experts across all areas of science and technology and innovation, and has them come up with policy recommendations, reports, et cetera. All of that information is in the public domain, and it's all available for free on the National Academy's website. So for example, and I'm sorry, I'm just harping on climate change because it's an easy example, but if you were wanting to talk about some of like the human health impacts of climate change, or environmental justice issues, and some of the issues around the disparate effects of climate and health disparities issues, there are National Academies reports that have already done a lot in that space. And so those are a source. Also, government agencies are constantly producing reports. They're producing strategic plans that are going to sort of say, we're going to work on this for the next 5 years. They're producing documents that are sort of post hoc analyses of funding and programs that they've already done. So government reports are a good source. Congressional Research Service, as I mentioned in my remarks, that a lot of that stuff is also in the public domain, and those are those policy neutral reports. And then again, those those think tank organizations, those are always going to be public, because that's just how those organizations work. So, and there are think tanks across the political spectrum, but then there are some that are viewed by people on both the right and the left as sort of the nonpartisan organizations. And so those are often a good place to go as well. I don't know if you have other thoughts on that, Adriana, but those are just some that come to mind.
Yeah, I think that's really good. Good start. I was just looking at, so in the breakouts, we'll be talking about federal funding for diversity programs, STEM research, immigration. These are sort of broad, but do you have any sort of specific resources for diversity kind of topics that we might be talking about today?
I think so. I know that the National Academies has done projects on this. Just yesterday, I was attending, as part of my day job, attending a meeting of the NIH Advisory Committee to the Director, and they were talking about reports around diversity and equity in biomedical research. So I think the resources are the same. It's just that as I gave the example of climate change, that you could use that example too of diversity, equity, inclusion issues.
Right, you're right, thanks. I think those are most of the questions. Let me see. Okay, I think that's mostly it. Are there any other tips or advice as we we'll go into the breakouts now from you.
No. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. I think this was really helpful between sort of the SACNAS framing as well as your presentation. So we'll sort of spend the next hour now writing some outlines. So I'll just give a little bit of introduction to how this is going to work. So we will have 5 rooms. We chose 5 topics that are, as I mentioned, sort of interesting and important to SACNAS, areas that SACNAS advocates on, and just broad topics that we can discuss as well. So we'll have Andrew Porter, who is the policy director at Science is Us. So he'll be moderating the room on federally funded STEM diversity programs. Lou Justamont is currently the president of FASEB. He'll focus on fair and equitable hiring and promotion. Jennifer Polhouse is the chief operating officer at Ripple Effect. And so her topic is more broad around evidence-based policy. Jasmine George is a PhD candidate at Morehouse. So they'll be talking about immigration policy. And then Rachel McKinley is a PhD candidate at Howard. And then we'll be talking about robust funding for STEM research. So given we have a little more time, we'll take until 4 o'clock Eastern to discuss. You'll have a list of questions to go through as a group and craft an outline for your memo. And then as we sort of have been discussing here, this will be hopefully also a good thought exercise about issues around diversity and policies around these topics that you can discuss with our moderators as well. So I'm going to share again the links to the documents just so everyone has it. This is Google Docs you'll be working in as a group. So I think that's it, and then we'll come back and recap. I'll ask moderators to provide a little takeaway from their room, and then we'll be done. Are there any questions before we move into the rooms? Looks like no. So if there are any issues or questions, feel free to come back here, and I will help you if you need to move around. I saw the questions, so we can address those sorts of things. If you want to move into a different room, feel free to come back in here, and then I can reassign. So I'll just go ahead and open them now then. All right, looks like everyone is back. Hope you've had some good conversations. I saw a lot of good notes. So let's hear from our moderators. You can speak for maybe 5 minutes, give us a few takeaways. You can walk us through some of the questions a little bit on what problems you're trying to solve, and policies you're thinking about implementing if you get to the end. Either way, hopefully it was helpful. So to mix it up a bit, let's start with Andre. Oh, sorry, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
There we go. Yeah.
All right, great. So we, of course, our topic was federally funded STEM diversity programs, and we had a bunch of different ideas on what problems to be addressed. But we zeroed in on retention, kind of broadly, retention programs, so programs that are implemented to retain people from underrepresented groups. Part of that, or subheaders under that, were to improve tracking of trainees that have left the pipeline, because that's a part of the retention aspects, right? And also facilitating better evaluation on federally supported STEM programs for diversity. We chose as a stakeholder group to focus specifically on one agency instead of being very broad. As an example, and the National Science Foundation is the one that we chose. And our policy solution that we kind of worked our way through was to develop a funding stream. So to recommend a new funding stream for the evaluation of existing STEM federally funded diversity programs with the intent to refine future proposals on STEM diversity. So using the mechanism of that evaluation of that funding stream to evaluate the current and existing portfolio at NSF, and then having that information get implemented into future RFIs, future calls for proposals, et cetera. See if and Adriana, let me know if I'm missing any point. I don't want to go over too long. And of course, this will advance the call by facilitating better information collection and improve the iterative process of RFI development, of solicitation development, to be more effective in increasing diversity in STEM programs. And I'll stop there. Let me know if I need to add any more information.
Great. No, that was a great summary. That's really interesting and very relevant. I can speak to this because I actually work on with NSF quite a bit. So that's very relevant to today's political issues and landscape, which is very important as well when you're writing these memos. Yeah, that was great. I don't have any other additions. We'll send this along to reviewers and then go through it more tomorrow, but thanks for that summary. Okay, so let's have Rachel go next.
Yeah, so our topic was on maintaining robust funding in STEM research. And so we decided that the main stakeholders that we would be writing to are the current committees that actually determine where the funds are allocated for STEM funding agencies. And so we decided that in terms of the option that we would mostly try and push for is to actually recommend an analysis of how current funds are being spent, and to create a model to of a trajectory of spending over time, and see how that correlates with the certain scientific advancements that are actually currently being done to give more transparency to Congress and to everyday people, so that people can see more so of how funding in science is allocated, and actually which disciplines in science that actually need to be funded more.
Great, that's a really good follow-up, I think, from what Andre was talking about. Did you have any specific agencies, or can you go a little more specific into what you're looking to change here?
So we didn't break it down to any specific agency. We were just thinking, I guess, more broadly of different agencies. So it could be NSF, it could be NIH, other funding agencies, kind of as an umbrella of just how STEM funding for STEM research in general.
Yeah, that's good. And I could say, there's a lot of talk about agencies working together these days, which I think, is a topic that can obviously improve more, but there's definitely things that they each bring to the table. And depending on what it is, as far as this workshop is concerned, you might direct it to NIH or NSF, depending on the topic you're writing on. So definitely go more in depth there. So great, thanks for that. I think that's a good segue to Jennifer and your topic.
Yeah, so I was in group 3, moderating group 3, and group 3 was talking about evidence-based policy decisions. And we had a great topic that relied on Colleen. I didn't get Colleen's last name, but Colleen's research on using wastewater treatment as a way to, testing wastewater to track COVID spread, and with the idea that it could be used as an early warning system, prior to getting like actual test, the actual COVID testing data that we're getting from test centers currently. And the argument would be that if we could expand the wastewater testing, it's going on currently very sporadically around different states, or different municipalities are doing it, but it's not being done comprehensively. And there are many places where there are gaps. And so, kind of bringing it as well to the inclusivity and the equity issue is that in particular, the populations which appear to be most impacted by COVID are those that are marginalized or underserved. And so increasing access to this type of testing could create an early warning scenario in those states or municipalities that would, eventually, be able to save lives, because there could be action that's taken on a local level. So what we talked through was kind of how could we suggest or encourage or require that that this be occurring more frequently, and not just more frequently, but more in a more comprehensive way. And we landed on advocating at each, like having a sort of a general proposal that we could customize for each state. But we felt that the action should occur at the state level, and that if we provided the state with general evidence that that we could collect across the country, and then customize the evidence to whatever the situation was in each of their states, share pros and cons of different strategies that they could take in their states, that would hopefully encourage them to take the action, because they would be able to see the benefits of taking action.
Great. That's obviously very relevant. And just to make some points in relation to the memo writing here, I think this is a really good example of something very specific that you can write on, and a very specific group to direct it to. Thank you for bringing back the equity angle. That's definitely something we can all think about through all these rooms. And again, that's very a good point too about how that affects different communities. And also, I like that you mentioned sort of what actions could be taken. So again, that's relevant to all the topics here, that you want to have something very specific that you are proposing in your memo, that is sort of, your conclusion, so to speak. So Libby didn't really go into all that as much in depth, but if you look at the JSPG examples, you can sort of get an idea of how specific that needs to be. So I think that was really helpful. Thank you, Jennifer. Mm-hmm. Let's go to Lou.
All right. So we're dealing with the topic of fair and equitable hiring and promotion. I think we had a great discussion. We certainly, I think, like many people and many topics, these are quite complex and multifaceted. And we were having a discussion on the differences in terms of the structural realities. So we were focusing on academia, industry, and government employment sectors, and the fact that when you think about fairness in hiring and promotion, that there are similarities, but then again, there are some very incredible differences between these sectors in terms of how these things are done and how they're regulated and controlled. This led us to go to the point that we felt like maybe there would be opportunities, at least for academic institutions and government agencies, to go to a higher level, which is the federal government, and perhaps even those committees in the House and Senate that oversee funding for the federal agencies that support STEM, and to enlist their help in identifying the measures and metrics that would be relevant to promoting DEI and gender equity across these different employment sectors. Now, this is very broad-based. So I think where we failed is that we didn't come up with an absolutely specific target that we would go to the government with and make a case about. But a good example would be one that was brought up in our discussion, and that is the fact that there was a recent article, someone mentioned it was in the New York Times, I believe. It was a Primal Scream article. I think basically it was about the effect of the pandemic on the success of women in science and other careers. Obviously here, I guess we're focused on STEM predominantly. And if we thought of that as the right example, which we could amend what we were talking about, it might be such to propose that, you know, we need to enact federal policy that would then be overarching and would feed down to those federal agencies that support funding for STEM, and that particularly relates to how can we enhance the ability of women to succeed in the face of things like the pandemic or other sociological or structural challenges that they uniquely face. So that would be the way I would amend our discussion on the fly.
That's very helpful. Yeah, and one thing to note is there's probably a lot of, you know, editing and going back and forth on sort of what I think starts as a very general idea and then gets to specific once, you know, I sort of submit that to the journal. But two things that you mentioned that were really helpful, I think the audience, because you said that, you know, it could be institutions, it could be other sectors. So that's something to keep in mind, depending on how you're writing your memo will be different based on who it's for. The other thing you talked about the federal and state level. So that's another consideration, is that a lot, you know, policy making obviously happens both at the federal and state level, and the way that you write the memo again will depend on where your target is and what sort of the scope of your writing is. So that's another thing to keep in mind based on what Blue said. So thank you for that. And Jasmine?
Hello, everybody. So our topic was immigration policy. And so because it is such a broad kind of a topic, we wanted to really focus it in on both what kind of immigration policy as well as where it would affect. And so we chose to focus on students who are recipients of DACA. And our problem is that they are not given sufficient financial opportunities and opportunities for citizenship post-graduation. And so we wanted to really focus, because every state has a very different way of handling DACA-related students and immigration policy in general. So we ranked kind of who had the most DACA recipients to the least, and we saw that California had the most. So we looked at some of their current agencies that are associated with immigration policy and DACA students. And we found that our stakeholders could include the California Student Aid Commission, of course, the DACA recipient offices and things like that, business owners and taxpayers, California Immigration Services, and university administrations. And so we found that for our policy options, we wanted to kind of do a opportunity to, once you graduate either high school or even your university degree, to be extended a residency status because you already qualify for DACA. So having that clear path to citizenship would be extremely useful for students in their future success. And kind of basing it on their completion of their degree, taking into consideration the socioeconomic status and their want or need to continue their education. And we said that it would be cost effective because it's cheaper than just massively deporting every single last person. And it helps them to provide and develop their skills further that they have already started while they were here. And so retaining them in the country and allowing them to use their skills for a residency status and eventually a work status, and a way to help financially improve their situation would be to incentivize some of these business owners and things through government subsidies to help provide worker permits for worker or job positions that might be specific towards people who are United States citizens. So that will help, for them to receive jobs that are within their field and to also benefit the economy around them, and to kind of get the business owners and taxpayers to agree. Some of the restrictions on these work permits could include, because we wanted to make sure that there was a sense of accountability with these work permits, there would be work attendance, a period of time that you would be working, removing penalties that would come from employing DACA recipients. And so we wanted to, for our one policy that we wanted to agree upon was the path to citizenship, because overall the problem is the documentation. You know, they're not able to get jobs, they're not able to obtain opportunities that would help forward their career. So focusing more on the students' path to citizenship would be helpful. And so we wanted to have this completion of degree program and start small with a more, possibly a more dense population of DACA recipients, start very small and do kind of a success analysis and say, okay, well, we gave this group of people a residency status and they were able to take this in XYZ. So do a cost benefit analysis with that success program. To look at how they are performing, because they now have a better opportunity to succeed in their degree programs, and they have a clearer way of knowing where they're going to go after they have completed their degree. Beside, you know, just and so that's kind of where what we're thinking. And again, the benefits would be that they would be able to contribute even greater to the U.S. economy. They'd be able to hone their skills on a personal level and improve their overall status, because a lot of these students we find are, you know, providing for their families and they're trying to find opportunities to improve their situation. So that's kind of where we went with that.
Great, that was really helpful. It seems like there's a lot to unpack here. But I like that it's very specific and you went really in depth into this issue. So this is, I think, another good example to really hone in on an issue and then go deeper into sort of the different aspects that we did that really well. One thing to note, so you mentioned sort of different factors that might be influencing this. One thing I would say is thinking about what is already out there on this topic, you know, sort of, which again, you would do that research when you're writing the memo, but sort of framing what you're proposing within what's already been done on DACA, because say that things have been done, but that's also helpful just for sort of framing your memo on this. And you know, you don't want to propose something that somebody else already proposed, right? So there's, you know, do your research. So that's my advice for that. But thank you, that was really helpful. Great. Okay, so it looks like we might be early. Do any of you have other last minute or final thoughts? No. Great. Yeah. All right, so to wrap up then, I wanted to share the link to our workshop series. So like I mentioned, this was the first in a series that will be upcoming, so you can learn more here. The next one will be March 6th, co-hosted with 500 women scientists. So we'll be focusing on issues that relate more to that specific group. You're welcome to sign up for that one or multiple ones if you'd like. And then tomorrow, as far as this session is concerned, tomorrow we'll have more in-depth discussions in breakout rooms with reviewers. So after this, probably in about hour and a half or 2 hours or so, I'll send the documents over. So if you have other edits, feel free to make them after this. And then we'll have folks who have some expertise in policy and DEI to review and discuss with you tomorrow, again, for about an hour. So we'll have another session for an hour and a half, discuss for an hour, and come back and recap from that, which has worked well before. So we'll see you all back here tomorrow at noon Eastern time. And thanks again to our moderators, speakers, and all of you for participating today. Thanks.
Thank you. Everybody have a good rest of your day.
You too.
Thank you. Great to meet you all.
It was great talking to everybody.
It was good.
Okay, I think we can start. People are still coming in, but I'll just go through a little bit of intro. So welcome to day 2. This is our workshop on impactful and inclusive policy memo writing, co-hosted with SACNAS as part of our series leading up to the JSPG special topics issue on intersectional science policy. So to give a brief intro for what will happen today. So following yesterday's session, you'll be joining breakout rooms. We actually combined rooms 1 and 5, which Brandy will do to sort of cover both topics since they're related. And then everyone else, every other room will have one moderator. So as I mentioned yesterday, our reviewers are science policy professionals who also have expertise in DEI. So we'll go through a few intros to give you a better idea of where they're coming from, sort of what their background is. And then, so I've asked them to just state their name, position, and talk a little bit about their policy background and how that might apply to today's event, as well as DEI expertise. And one thing that you think that participants should take away from your room. And then to make this more interactive, if we can sort of do it to when you're done, kick it off to the next person and sort of have you guys moderate this part before we go into the room. So let's start with Brandy.
Good morning. My name is Brandy Henderson. I am a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow, and I'm also an assistant professor of biology at the University of the District of Columbia, affectionately known as UDC. My experience with policy is actually relatively new. I really didn't get into policy I didn't really get into policy until I joined the fellowship. I'd done some work with STEM education, didn't really know that it was policy work, but I've been at National Science Foundation since 2019. I work with portfolio evaluation. I do a lot of work with broadening participation in DEI, and currently work with one of the other reviewers here, Yolanda Avant, as a part of her diversity consulting team. It's Sunday. So I think Utabe is next on my screen.
Hello, everyone. I had issues unmuting. I am Utabe Bickham Wright. I am also AAA Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the National Science Foundation. And I'm fairly new to policy, and it's through the introduction of this fellowship being placed at the NSF with the Advanced program. And the program I'm currently working with focuses on gender equity, but from a systemic change and organizational change perspective. And so that's my learning into policy, and that's what I hope to share and bring to my room as well. Oh, and I'm kicking it off to Anne. Sorry.
No worries. Anne, I have an easy choice for the last panelist. My name is Anne Cornarens. I'm currently working at the American Physical Society. I actually previously was a AAAS fellow at NSF, so I have that in common. And focused while at NSF on broadening participation, diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives across a variety of fields that are all held in one part of NSF: physics, astronomy, math, chemistry, and materials. My background's in chemistry, but doing the fellowship was a really amazing opportunity to do cross-disciplinary work in a way that's very different than collaborations you might do in research and in the lab. And following that, I am now working at a professional society for physicists. My project is in particular focused on the high school to college transition for young women, and really thinking about how do we change the culture of physics, how do we change the conversations we have around who can and should be allowed to be in certain STEM fields. So my project's called Step Up, usually APS. I'm based in College Park, Maryland, but I live in DC and I'm working from there now. And then I think the last question was about takeaways from the room. And so I'll just say that I'm excited about this opportunity to learn together and to hear from my room what they're thinking about. And for me, learning about policy and learning about policy memos was, how do you convincingly argue your point, and what is the best way to make an argument that really is true to what you care about. So I think mirroring and marrying those two pieces is something that we can talk about. And so I will pass it to Yolanda.
Hi, everyone. My name is Yolanda Avent, and I serve as the CEO and founder of Avent Diversity Consulting. So I've been doing diversity, equity, and inclusion consulting work for about 22 years. I've worked in higher education for over 22 years in diversity, equity, and inclusion as well. I also serve as the DEI program manager for the state of Virginia for the Department of Motor Vehicles. So in terms of that, that's where some of my policy work comes in, and working with the government and legislators on things that impact our citizens in the Commonwealth of Virginia from the Department of Motor Vehicles perspective. One example of that would be having the non-binary identities on our licenses, and then looking at how that impacts our entire Commonwealth of Virginia, how we rolled it out, what that looks like. But even the negotiations that take place in our General Assembly around those things. What else? I have also served as an adjunct professor in various universities. I worked with a fellowship with the National Science Foundation in Taiwan, looking at educational motivation and psychology and the intersection of engineering with that for a little while, many years ago. So really just, in terms of the takeaways, just excited about you all making those, connections. Please ask questions. If I could give you any takeaway, please ask questions, especially if you are confused about anything. I may not have all the answers, but I certainly will try to get them and provide some resources as well. So part of my specialties are focused on implicit bias and emotional intelligence. So, thank you.
Great, thanks for those intros. So there's a lot of good expertise here. So just to reiterate that, definitely ask questions. So I'm going to share the documents from yesterday. This is just, everyone has the link to the breakout documents that you worked in. So the reviewers made comments, you can review those. And then there's also a rubric. I'm going to share that as well, the reviewer documents that you can look at, and you all will discuss that. So I think that's it for me, the intro. Does anybody have questions before we go into the rooms?
Will we be automatically kicked out the rooms at time, or?
Yeah, so I'll let you know. So let's see, we'll do this until 1 p.m. Eastern, and then we'll come back and recap if y'all can give some takeaways. So I'll sort of call on you to do that. And then I'll send reminders when we have 5 minutes left, 1 minute, and so on, so you know when the time is up.
Thank you.
All right, sounds good. So I'll be here. If there's any issues or questions, feel free to leave the room and come back to the main room. Otherwise, enjoy, and then we'll see you back here at 1. All right, so welcome back. Hope you gained some valuable knowledge. I'll just now have each moderator report back for maybe 5 minutes or so about your takeaways. Can we start with Anne?
Sure. I took a couple notes for myself to share out our conversation. We were a mixed group of folks who had worked on a immigration policy memo and some who had worked on others. So we had additional outside perspectives, which I thought was very valuable, and a great recommendation that I didn't say explicitly to the group. But obviously, if you have somebody who can imitate your target audience or somebody who's outside of the issue, read through policy memos for you, that's a really, in general, editors are great, right? Getting feedback is great, but I think that's an excellent choice for writing policy memos in the future. So we did some great introductions. I heard a lot about takeaways from yesterday, which I really appreciated, and we used to mold the conversation that we had. A couple being that trying to be concise and clear, and it takes a lot of thought to write a policy memo, someone said, and I pointed out that sometimes it takes a lot of thought and you don't have a lot of time. So we worked on how do we hone in on what we really need to say quickly so that we can put all that thought in without a lot of time. And we also noted some of the differences to academic writing. And that came in again during our conversation where, unlike maybe writing a research paper, you don't get to do all the experiments and you don't get to have all of the answers, but you're making your best guess and you're making your best recommendations. And we did have an opportunity at the very end. One of the last examples was about how could we use evidence-based policy from other contexts and try to incorporate that into our policy memo. So, just because something hasn't been done with kind of strict experimental protocol in your exact context, that's okay. We can learn from other examples and other policies that have been rolled out elsewhere. So focusing in on the memo in particular and talking through the outline that was really well written by group 4. We focused in on 2 places where I felt like from an outline to the policy memo, it could be strengthened. In this particular case, and probably in general, if you write a quick outline for your policy memo, you're not going to go into depth, I don't think, on the specifics of the background that I think need to be incorporated, and then the specific, concise details on your policy options. So we went through those 2 areas. We started with the background, thought about what more did we need to incorporate about DACA students in California, which was the specific context of the policy memo around immigration, and what statistics could we pull in about the context in California. But even more so, if our target audience was the California Immigration Services, how do we make assumptions in this kind of hypothetical case, or how do you learn in the case that you're working on your memo, what they already know, so you're not telling them, what DACA stands for and putting yourself in a position that doesn't show your expertise because you know that they know that. So you're going to tell them about this one white paper that was released on the effects on students who have this uncertain pathway to citizenship. And that's why you're going to make these policy recommendations. So we talked quite a bit through the background on how it could be strengthened and deepened in a full policy memo. And then we went through the policy options very briefly at the end to think about how do we make it specific, on what time scale, how many students are we talking about. One of the things that I love that the group did is in this framework of writing out your policy memo outline, at the bottom there's a how would you implement it? And that answers to the question about implementing their policy option, focused in on a pilot with high school students. And that's where I saw the specificity coming in. So I think as you're writing policy options, ask yourself those questions of how would it actually be implemented? Because the stakeholder who's reading your policy memo doesn't want to have to think through that. They want you to have thought through, what do I actually mean in terms of policy option number 1 is the one we're going with. What are the specifics of how that's going to be implemented? So that is it.
Great, thanks. That's really helpful. I think that's kind of general across the board from what I've seen too, that honing in on really the specifics is something that takes practice, and groups did that pretty well. And I will vouch for the other thing you said about having little time. Those of us who work in policy and quickly have to turn around memos in 24 hours, sometimes that is a reality. So it's a good skill to be able to do it quickly. Yeah. Thanks. Let's go to Yolanda.
Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, so in our group, we talked about, we talked so much, I probably didn't do a really good job of taking as many notes, but we talked about hiring and promotion in terms of a DEI perspective, and we focused really on higher education. And so some of the takeaways is really thinking about in higher education being more inclusive of not just thinking about the academy as faculty, but being inclusive of staff as well, and thinking about all of those key partners. And so how do these policies around hiring and promotion and retention affect all aspects of higher education? And so we dove down to possibly thinking about some of the sub levels and the protections that some people have and don't have. So even within faculty, who has power and agency that other people don't have. So we think about adjuncts, we think about pay equity, and really sort of breaking out what DEI is. So diversity, equity, and inclusion. From representation, you can't include people who aren't there. So thinking about what that looks like in hiring and promotion, but also really thinking about what was the impact from the problem perspective of having some of the things. So the group named things that were wonderful, like implicit bias, explicit bias, and even though they didn't outrightly say, but microaggressions, how do these things impact? And that's what we sort of focused on. What is the impact? So discrimination, looking at the high turnover rate in higher education for Black and brown people, as well as women and the LGBTQ community. So really not being afraid to name a lot of the people and the spaces within that. So thinking about the other piece we talked about a good deal was stakeholders and the influence of stakeholders. So thinking about influencers and stakeholders. So you can have a whole bunch of stakeholders, but within those stakeholders, who are going to be your influencers that really can move policy forward? So for instance, for higher education, we talked about not only the faculty, but are there chief diversity officers, the president, the faculty senate, the graduate students assemblies, the SGAs, your equity office or accessibility office. And then the other piece we talked about was accreditation bodies, who can have huge influences on what people do and how they do it. And also, so for Virginia, for instance, SHEV, which is the State Council of Higher Education in Virginia. So how can we use these as influencers to make sure that whatever pieces we were putting in place are happening? So one of the things we talked about is with DEI, there has to be accountability, right? So if it's not accountability, it's not going to happen. And so we talked about the federal government's role in issuing some of these things. So from a standpoint of law and governance, equity, Title IX, affirmative action, EEO, all of those things. And then looking at, to your point, policy options in terms of benchmarking models, pay equity, promotion tenure, hiring panels, is breaking it down a little bit into some of the areas that would need to be regulated more for quality assurance, and also benchmarking other sort of model, if you will, institutions that are making changes. The other thing we talked about, and the group members talked about, was our professional organizations, because a lot of times in the accreditation process, your professional organizations are going to have a huge impact in the things that are done. And so what is professional organization saying about DEI? And one of the group members brought up a really good perspective, is that a lot of our professional organizations may be made up of the same people from 20, 30, 40 years ago, which could be reflective of basically all white men. So how are we diversifying? How are we critically analyzing these groups who are accreditation bodies or professional organizations and so forth, and infusing, DEI into those? So those are some things that we talked about. Let me see, make sure I'm missing anything. Yep, retention, impact of it, higher promotion. Yep, and again, just naming the issues. And so you drill down to say race, right? And you say, we're going to focus on race, then looking at race, but also looking at all of the categories that are significant for your institution or for your level. So it can't just be, you may not have an issue with, having, Black women in faculty, for instance. I would doubt it, but you may not have an issue. So then what are the other pieces of race? And do you have, in terms of Chicano professors or Asian professors, or, what are the intersectionality of that? And particularly, we talked a little bit about gender and race. So, and one thing I thought of at the end, because somebody named it, is talking about, we focused, in this group focused a lot on government influence and impacting and affecting, but what happens when the government doesn't believe in DEI? So if you have an executive order that came through, and I think it was Eric that brought this up, the executive order in one of their professional associations that comes through that says, we don't want anything to do with DEI, then what do you do if you're relying on the government to do that? And I think that's where there's accredited bodies, associations, and influencers can help fill in the gap, stand in the gap of those things. So I'll in there.
Great, thanks for that. Sounds like a really rich conversation. I really appreciate your expertise that you're bringing here. Because obviously part of what we're trying to do is sort of infuse DEI in all of these topics and figure out how that is, we can write policies on these topics. So that's really helpful. And I really like your point about stakeholders and influencers. That's something that I think is very relevant to sort of day-to-day as well, and who to target for these memos. So thank you so much for that. Okay, YouTube.
Okay, yes. So in our room, we focused on evidence-based policy decisions. And the topic was COVID and wastewater testing. And it was very focused on that. So basically, trying to encourage states to devote funds to testing the wastewater system at the state governmental level. And we spent some time talking about just taking a step back and talking about the point of the memo. So basically, because this is an evidence-based policy decision theme, a lot of information and stats had to be given, right? Because you're trying to convince a decision maker to follow your recommendation. So really making sure that you include the necessary stats to help them make their decision, because oftentimes, as been mentioned here before, this memo has to be done relatively fast because the decision makers need it. And you want to make sure that the information that's contained in it is based on solid facts that they can then stand on and make an argument if needed. And so looking at the pros and cons, making sure that you're coming from a place of well-roundedness. So not just saying, I think this is the solution that we should take, but also showcasing that you are aware of the other possibilities and then showcasing that. So in that, we talked about something that was a stat that was highlighted, which basically showed that in the wastewater testing, you saw that 50 to 80% of the people shed COVID in their waste. And kind of the tone of the memo was to, as outlined, was to basically devote funds from individual testing to now doing wastewater treatment plant testing alone. And through our discussions, it was basically reshaped to show that this would be a complementary to individual testing, because that stat isn't convincing. And giving a memo to a decision maker with just that stat alone wouldn't be enough to suffice. So basically, you would have to provide a well-rounded evidence-based information for that. And then we also discussed different types of memos. So some of the participants defaulted to evidence-based memos. So we talked a little bit about what other types of memos do people write. And so I tried to highlight in the group that it's situational, right? Sometimes people just need information, information on this topic. You're not always trying to convince someone to take a stand. So basically, that would be situational, and you just have to be ready when needed to provide additional information when needed. And let me look at my stats. And then going back to the topic of the wastewater memo, when we got to the implementation question, so how will you implement this solution? We spent a little time discussing the difference between still making a recommendation versus saying, we know what the issue is. This is the background on the issue, but this is the next step to the issue, to solving basically the solution to it in the next steps, which moving from convincing to how to and execution and implementation. So we spent a little time discussing that. And I think we had a really rich discussion. And I hope that the takeaways from the room was that a one-pager could be short, but also it could be jam-packed, and that you should approach it with a mindset of this is all they have time to read. So try to jam-pack as much information that's based on evidence as possible, but also having additional information ready when needed. So I think we had a really good discussion there, and those are the notes that I have. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's really interesting and obviously broadly applicable to any of the topics here. What you mentioned about facts and evidence-based, having the background. So we discussed this yesterday as well. Sort of looking at what's been done on the issue and framing what your options are based on what's already out there sort of in the landscape. And then like your point about information versus persuasion. So that's, keep that in mind to what you're trying to do with your memo and how to write it. So very good points. Thank you. Brandy?
So I just had breakout group 1, and the focus was about federally funded STEM diversity plans and so programs. And so we kind of, I'm sorry, my camera's off. We kind of worked our way through what it is exactly that they wanted to concentrate on. It's kind of a broad topic. And so getting a good so being able to use the proper terminology to accurately convey your thoughts. So we did spend a good bit of time talking about definitions for things like retention, clearly defining what is meant by diversity. There were some other terms in there that we talked about too, just an understanding that concise doesn't necessarily mean short, right? So you can, if you have the option to use a word that doesn't really mean much, as opposed to using 3 words that does, for the purpose of your memo, it might make more sense to use those 3 words. We talked about a lot of the same things that have already been mentioned, thinking about the fact that this is a briefing memo, so it is designed to convey the high points about a topic to someone who could literally be reading this as they're walking from the elevator to their desk. And so you need to make sure you keep their attention, because one slip and they're like, okay, I'm over this. So making sure that you are providing them with information they need. We talked about references, whether you should include a list of references. You have a 1-page briefing, you don't have that kind of precious real estate, but we have hyperlinks. So if they're interested in getting more information, we can always link the information in the document. Understanding that so one question that came up that was really good is, what do they do with this memo when they get it? Are they going to go off and enact it? Or sometimes this memo can be combined with other memos that have been received that they can address all at one time. They may simply ask you to provide them with more information, but there's a lot of things that can happen after you turn this in, and you just really have to be on your toes. So we talked a lot about the audience. So what you put in this memo is going to be highly dependent upon who you're sending it to. So there was a question asking about, do we need to include budgetary information? Well, it depends. If you are sending this to someone at NSF who is a program officer, they may not need to have the overall budget that comes from Congress. But if you're sending this to Congress, the first thing Congress wants to know is how much it's going to cost. It almost doesn't, I won't say it doesn't matter, but that's the big thing that Congress has to worry about. They are the purse strings. Thinking about different people to write to. So Yolanda mentioned, for example, talking about the higher organization of institutions. So a briefing memo, for example, may not be the best thing to send to a president, because they're going to want all this information so they can present it to their trustees, right? But if you're sending this to the director of NSF, you really need to give him a half a page, right? So understanding your audience, understanding what it is you're trying to convey. This particular memo was focused at NSF. So trying to figure out who at NSF you want to write to. So do you want to write to the director of NSF? Do you want to write to the National Science Board, which is the regulatory board for National Science Foundation? Do you want to send this to the Office of Science and Technology Policy, who is the overall person in charge of the National Science Foundation? So who do you want to send this to? Understanding what it means to be retention, understand what diversity programs you're talking about, how they, and this particular memo talked about evaluation. It is an evaluation proposal memo, but understanding what type of evaluation you're asking for. So if you're sending this to NSF, what directorate? Some of the directorates already have evaluation programs in place. So then what are you asking for them to do? So being very precise in your ask. We had a very diverse group of people in the group in terms of where they are in their careers right now. So we have students, we have people who are working on in evaluation spaces right now, people who have different levels of experience with memo writing. So that really helped out to kind of flush out all of the different pieces about where you are with the memo, what it's going to do, the purpose. I encourage them to think about where they are in terms of their perspective and think one layer above them. So sometimes we kind of get stuck in our own perspective and we can't see past this. You know, as graduate students, by the time you're getting to the last stages, you have a great disdain for the academe, right? But think about how you make that next step. Think about what's going on above you. So think about how you would feel if you were sitting in your PI's position, and think about how do you write from that perspective when you're writing the memos. I think that's it. I think those are the major points. The main things that I really want to convey them, though, is to make sure that you're using really effective language to get your point across. You don't want anybody to have to think about what you're trying to say. You want them to understand. There was a question about vagueness. It's strategic. This is a strategic document. So if you're going to be vague about something, it needs to be a strategic move. It should not be an accident. You don't want anybody to get confused. You want to direct their confusion. You know, you want their confusion to lead to them calling you back to give them more information on this, not to be annoyed with what they don't know. So I think that's basically what we talked about.
Great, very helpful, thanks. So a lot of good points here too. Again, just to generalize all the memos that what you mentioned about explaining the terms. So what do we mean by diversity? And obviously whatever topic you're writing on, make sure that's clear what the terms mean. The high points, definitely, and then the audience and the scope. So I think that's, again, if you check some of the JSPG memos, you'll see sort of different levels of addressing this to, like Brandy mentioned, to a director or sort of higher level, who that is and how you write that. So definitely encourage you to check out sort of past examples on some of these topics from JSPG as well to see the format. Great, thank you. So if there's no any last parting thoughts from any of you guys?
I just have one comment that I took a note of but forgot to mention. So we were in the evidence-based, policy room, right? And a question about what happens when it's a new situation and there is no evidence. What do you do then? And so we talked a little bit about expertise, right? That's when you rely on experts in the field. And use similar situations. So like in the case of COVID, since that's what the room focused on, COVID is new. We haven't had COVID before, but in the discussions, we've reached back to what we know about the Spanish flu, so but being able to like draw back on examples from history and also relying on the expertise. And also if you expertise, and some of them could be mathematical modeling, depending on the topic. So really looking at all your resources when presented with something new. So I wanted to make a note of that for the general group as well. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Definitely. Oh, Yolanda, go ahead.
Yeah, I just was going to say, I think the thing I would also want to mention that we didn't kind of get around to is DEI is not just about kind of how people feel. There's a business impact to it. So think about it as a business impact when you're trying to change people's mind, is there's a bottom line. And so if you can tie the research to the bottom line of how having diverse groups, diverse board, diverse leadership then ties back to the bottom line. That's important. It's not just about how we feel, but people speak different languages. So some people listen to data, some people are like focused on the bottom line. Figure out who your audience is, and that's no different with DEI. It absolutely has a bottom line.
Right, I think that's a great point to end on, and thank you for both your comments. Sort of trying to do this here too as well, sort of pick out sort of main things that may be applicable to everyone here, regardless of what you worked on today. So hopefully that was helpful. Oh, there's a comment. There we go. Great job. All right. Thanks. So just to close, so I want to thank all of our moderators. Thank you so much for your comments and then participating today and helping. I think it looks like it was really helpful for the audience, and thanks to the participants, especially those who are here both days. I know it's a long time to give up, but hopefully it was helpful to gain some knowledge over the weekend. And just before closing, I want to remind you that we'll have more of these workshops coming up. So let me share in the chat. Oops. So we'll basically be doing this for 2 more weekends, one with 500 women scientists, and then the next one will be with National Society for Black Engineers, again, focusing on sort of some issues that those groups are interested in. And so feel free to sign up for one or more than one if you're interested in joining again. And then to just remind you, JSPG is on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at SciPol Journal. So feel free to follow us, as well as we'll post this recording on YouTube, and you can watch it later. So if you can, I would also suggest subscribing to the YouTube channel for future events. So thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and thanks again for joining us.